The photograph arrived at the Smithsonian Institution on March 14, 1892, wrapped in yellowed cloth and accompanied by a single handwritten note that read only, "Document what you can. Destroy what you cannot." The image itself measured 8 inches by 10, printed on albumen paper using a collodion wet plate process common to the 1870s. It depicted a woman and a child standing before a wooden cabin in what appeared to be the Appalachian Mountains. The woman's face was turned slightly away from the camera, her features blurred by either movement or deliberate avoidance. But the child stared directly into the lens with eyes that seemed to penetrate not just the camera, but time itself. Museum archivists who handled the photograph reported an inexplicable unease when viewing it for extended periods. One noted in her diary that the child's gaze follows you across the room, as though the photograph is not a frozen moment but a window that remains open. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because some photographs are not meant to be forgotten, but remembered as warnings from those who came before us. The Appalachian region in the 1870s existed as a world apart from the rapidly industrializing eastern cities. These mountains, stretching from southern New York to northern Alabama, contained isolated communities where families lived according to rhythms unchanged for generations. Travel between settlements required days of difficult hiking through dense forests and treacherous terrain. Mail arrived irregularly. Census takers often skipped entire valleys, unable or unwilling to navigate the hostile geography. This isolation bred its own culture, its own superstitions, and its own silences. The people who lived in these hollows spoke in dialects so thick that visitors from Pittsburgh or Charleston could barely comprehend them. They practiced folk medicine passed down through oral tradition, buried their dead in family plots on steep hillsides, and regarded outsiders with the suspicion born from decades of exploitation by timber companies and coal speculators. In this landscape, photography was rare. The equipment required to produce images using the wet plate collodion process was expensive, fragile, and demanded technical expertise. A photographer had to coat a glass plate with a mixture of collodion and light-sensitive silver salts, expose it while still wet, and develop it immediately in a portable darkroom. The entire procedure, from preparation to final image, had to be completed within 15 minutes, or the plate would dry and become useless. Most Appalachian families had never seen a camera, much less posed for one. Those few photographs that survive from this period typically depict more accessible communities near railroad lines or river towns. Images from the deep hollows are almost non-existent, which makes the photograph that arrived at the Smithsonian so historically significant and so deeply unsettling. The woman in the photograph wore a simple cotton dress, threadbare and patched at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back severely, revealing a high forehead and prominent cheekbones. Her hands, visible at her sides, were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who worked soil and wood daily. She stood rigidly, as though the act of being photographed caused her physical discomfort, but her posture suggested something beyond mere unfamiliarity with the camera. It suggested fear. The child beside her could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The child wore a white linen shirt, surprisingly clean given the rough cabin visible behind them. But it was the face that arrested attention. The bone structure seemed unusual, the proportions slightly off in ways difficult to articulate. The eyes were set wider apart than normal, giving the face an almost amphibian quality. And those eyes themselves, dark and enormous, seemed to contain a depth of knowledge impossible for a child of that age. When the photograph first circulated among Smithsonian staff, 3 researchers independently noted the same detail. The child cast no shadow. The woman's shadow fell clearly to her left, consistent with late afternoon sunlight coming from the right side of the frame. The cabin behind them also cast appropriate shadows, but where the child stood, the ground showed no corresponding darkness. One archivist suggested it was merely an artifact of the photographic process, perhaps an error in exposure or development. But the photographer who had created this image was clearly skilled. Every other element of the photograph demonstrated technical mastery. The focus was sharp, the tonal range excellent, the composition deliberate. This was not the work of an amateur who might make such an elementary mistake. The note that accompanied the photograph provided no useful information. The handwriting was educated, the script flowing and controlled, but there was no signature, no return address, no identification of any kind. The postmark on the outer wrapping indicated the package had been sent from Wheeling, West Virginia, but inquiries to that city's postal authorities yielded nothing. The Smithsonian assigned the photograph an accession number, filed it in their growing collection of American frontier documentation, and attempted to forget about it. But certain objects resist forgetting. Over the following months, staff members who worked in the archive began reporting disturbing dreams. Always the same image. A child standing in darkness, watching them with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Dr. Helena Marsden encountered the photograph in October 1893 while researching Appalachian settlement patterns for her dissertation at Johns Hopkins University. She was 28 years old, one of only a handful of women permitted to pursue advanced degrees in anthropology, and she approached her work with the methodical intensity of someone who understood that every error would be magnified by her gender. Her focus was the migration of Scots-Irish families into the mountain regions and their adaptation to the isolated environment. The Smithsonian's photographic archive represented one of the few primary source collections available to her, and she spent weeks examining hundreds of images, making careful notes about clothing, architecture, and visible tools that might indicate technological development. When she opened the file containing the Appalachian mother and child, she experienced what she later described in her journal as an immediate and irrational conviction that I was looking at something I should not see. She studied the image for several minutes, noting the architectural details of the cabin, the type of wood used in its construction, the absence of any visible crops or livestock. Then she looked at the child's face. She found herself unable to look away. The eyes in the photograph seemed to establish a direct connection with her own, creating a sensation of being observed rather than observing. She closed the file, marked it for further review, and continued with her research. But that night, she dreamed of standing in a forest clearing while something watched her from between the trees. Dr. Marsden returned to the photograph 3 days later, this time bringing specialized measuring instruments. She carefully documented the proportions of the child's face, comparing them to established anthropometric data. The measurements confirmed her initial impression. The facial structure fell outside normal human variation. The distance between the eyes measured nearly 15% greater than the statistical average. The cranium appeared slightly elongated, giving the head an ovoid shape. Most disturbingly, when she measured the pupils in the photograph using a jeweler's loupe, she discovered they were not circular but slightly elliptical, oriented vertically. She made detailed notes, then consulted with Dr. Raymond Foster, a colleague specializing in physical anthropology and human variation. Dr. Foster examined the photograph with clinical detachment. He agreed the facial proportions were unusual, but suggested several possible explanations: malnutrition during crucial developmental periods, genetic abnormalities resulting from isolated breeding populations, or simply the distortions inherent in early photographic processes. He noted that collodion wet plates could sometimes create optical aberrations, particularly in high-contrast situations. The child's pale skin against the dark background might have created exposure complications that distorted the image. Dr. Marsden accepted his explanations, but remained troubled. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "Foster is correct about the technical possibilities, but technical accuracy does not explain why I feel watched when I look at this image. It does not explain why I dream of forests I have never seen." She decided to trace the photograph's origin. The Smithsonian's records indicated only that it had arrived unsolicited with a note suggesting documentation and destruction. The postmark from Wheeling gave her a starting point. She wrote to the postmaster there, requesting any information about packages sent to Washington in March 1892. She contacted regional historical societies in West Virginia, asking if anyone recognized the cabin or had records of itinerant photographers working the mountain areas in the 1870s. She placed advertisements in newspapers across the Appalachian region, describing the photograph and asking for information. For months, she received no responses. Then, in February 1894, a letter arrived from a woman named Sarah Good in Richwood, West Virginia. Mrs. Good wrote that she recognized the cabin in the photograph. It had belonged to the Kincaid family, who lived in a hollow called Raven's Gap, about 30 miles northeast of Richwood. The family had consisted of Thomas Kincaid, his wife Martha, and their child, whose name Mrs. Good could not recall or had never known. The Kincaids had lived in extreme isolation, even by mountain standards, and were regarded with unease by neighboring families. Mrs. Good's father had visited the Kincaid cabin once in 1876 to deliver mail and had told her that the child weren't right, though he never explained what he meant by that phrase. The family had disappeared sometime in the late 1870s. The cabin had been found abandoned with no sign of struggle or flight, just empty rooms and cold ashes in the fireplace. Local people assumed the Kincaids had simply moved on, perhaps seeking better land or fleeing debts. No one investigated further. No one wanted to. Dr. Marsden immediately arranged travel to West Virginia. She arrived in Richwood on March 3, 1894, and met with Mrs. Good, who provided directions to Raven's Gap. The journey required hiring a guide familiar with the mountains, a man named Elijah Booth, who supplemented his income by leading hunters and the occasional researcher into the backcountry. Booth agreed to take her to the Kincaid place, but only after extracting a promise that they would not remain after dark. When Dr. Marsden asked why, he replied simply, "Some places don't want people there after the sun goes down. You feel it in your bones." They departed Richwood on March 5th, traveling by horse along a rutted logging road that deteriorated into a narrow trail after the first 8 miles. The forest closed around them, dense stands of oak and hickory giving way to darker groves of hemlock and pine. The temperature dropped as they climbed higher into the mountains. Dr. Marsden, unaccustomed to such travel, found herself exhausted within hours, but Booth maintained a steady pace, speaking little and watching the tree line with an attention she found unsettling. When she asked if they were in danger from animals, he shook his head. "Not animals I'm watching for," he said, and refused to elaborate. They reached Raven's Gap late in the afternoon. The hollow was a narrow valley carved between 2 steep ridges, accessible only through a gap where a small creek had cut through the rock over centuries. The trees here grew so thick that the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Booth stopped at the mouth of the gap and pointed. "Kincaid Place is about half a mile in. We got maybe 2 hours of good light left. You want to see it? We need to move now and not linger." The cabin stood in a small clearing, exactly as it appeared in the photograph. 18 years of weather had stripped much of the wood to gray, and part of the roof had collapsed, but the structure remained recognizable. Dr. Marsden approached slowly, her academic training warring with an instinctive reluctance to get closer. The front door hung open, tilted on broken hinges. She stepped inside. The interior consisted of 2 rooms, a main living space with a stone fireplace and a smaller sleeping area, separated by a hanging blanket now rotted to fragments. A table and 2 chairs remained, coated in dust and bird droppings. Shelves lined one wall, empty except for a few rusted cans. But it was the walls themselves that drew Dr. Marsden's attention. Someone had carved symbols into the wood, hundreds of them, covering every surface. They were not letters or recognizable script, but something else entirely. Spirals and angular shapes that seemed to shift and reorganize themselves as she tried to focus on them. She removed her notebook and began sketching the symbols, working quickly in the fading light. "We need to go," Booth called from outside. "Now!" Dr. Marsden ignored him, moving to the sleeping area. Here the symbols were even more dense, carved so deeply into the wood that the walls had been weakened, splitting in places. In the center of the small room, someone had drawn a circle in what appeared to be ash or charcoal. Within the circle, more symbols. She knelt to examine them more closely and saw that some of the marks were not carved but burned, as though someone had pressed heated metal against the wood in deliberate patterns. "Dr. Marsden." Booth's voice carried real fear now. "Something's not right. We have to leave." She stood, gathered her materials, and returned to the main room. Through the open door, she could see that the quality of light had changed. The forest had grown darker, but not with the gradual dimming of sunset. This was something else, a premature night that seemed to pool between the trees like liquid, and in that darkness, something moved. Booth had already mounted his horse. "Get on," he commanded. Dr. Marsden climbed up behind him, and he kicked the animal into motion, moving back toward the gap at a speed that would have been reckless in better light. She looked back once and saw a figure standing in the cabin doorway. Small, child-sized, watching them leave with eyes that caught the last rays of sunlight and reflected them back like polished metal. If you're feeling the weight of this story, if something about this image unsettles you in ways you cannot name, leave a comment with just one word: watching. Let me know you're here. Let me know you understand that some things observe us across time, waiting to be seen. They rode in silence until they cleared the gap, and only then did Booth slow the horse to a manageable pace. He did not speak until they had put several miles between themselves and Raven's Gap. Finally, as they paused to rest the horse beside a creek, he said, "My grandfather came from these mountains. He told stories about families that went into the deep hollows and came back changed. He said there are places where the world is thin, where other things can come through if you're not careful. Said the old people knew how to protect themselves, knew what symbols to use and what words to say. But sometimes someone would forget, or get greedy, or just be unlucky, and then something else would get in." Dr. Marsden asked what he meant by something else. Booth looked at her with an expression mixing pity and frustration. "You're educated. You think everything can be explained and measured and written down in books, but there are things that don't fit in books. Things that don't have names because giving them names makes them more real." He paused, then added, "That child in the photograph you showed Mrs. Good. That's what happens when something else gets in." Dr. Marsden returned to Baltimore with her sketches of the symbols and a profound sense that she had glimpsed something her academic training had not prepared her to understand. She spent weeks researching comparative symbology, consulting with colleagues who specialized in indigenous American cultures, European folk traditions, and even ancient Near Eastern scripts. None of the symbols matched any known system. They existed outside the catalog of human communication, suggesting either an entirely isolated development or something that did not originate with humans at all. In May 1894, she received a second letter from Sarah Good. A traveling preacher named Reverend Silas Hartwell had passed through Richwood, and upon hearing about Dr. Marsden's interest in the Kincaid family, had shared a story. In 1877, Reverend Hartwell had attempted to bring religion to the isolated families in the mountains around Raven's Gap. He had visited the Kincaid cabin and been received with cold politeness by Thomas Kincaid, who made it clear that the family had no interest in salvation or spiritual guidance. But it was the child that Reverend Hartwell remembered most clearly. The child had not spoken during his visit, had simply stood in the corner of the cabin and stared at him with what he described as ancient eyes in a young face. When Reverend Hartwell began to recite scripture, the child had smiled. And in that smile, the Reverend said, he saw something that made him flee the cabin and never return to that part of the mountains again. Reverend Hartwell was now quite old and lived in a church-run home in Charleston. Dr. Marsden traveled there immediately. She found him in the common room, a frail man of 73 whose hands shook but whose mind remained clear. He remembered the Kincaid family vividly. "I have spent my life bringing the word of God to people in darkness," he told her. "I have seen poverty that would break your heart, violence that would sicken your soul, despair so deep it seemed bottomless. But in that cabin, I encountered something worse than any human suffering. I encountered absence. The child was there physically present, but there was nothing human inside. Just something wearing the shape of a child, watching and waiting." Dr. Marsden asked what it might be waiting for. Reverend Hartwell shook his head. "I don't know, but I had the sense that it had been there a very long time, much longer than the age of the body it inhabited, and that it would remain there long after that body was gone, moving from one vessel to another, always watching, always patient." He paused, then added, "You have the photograph, don't you? The one that shows the mother and child?" When Dr. Marsden confirmed this, he nodded slowly. "Burn it. Don't study it, don't archive it, don't try to understand it. Some doors should not be opened, Dr. Marsden. Some things should not be invited to look back at us." She did not burn the photograph. Instead, she intensified her research, now convinced that the Kincaid child represented something unprecedented in anthropological literature. She examined medical texts dealing with genetic abnormalities, psychiatric case studies of children displaying unusual behaviors, and folklore collections from dozens of cultures. She found suggestive parallels: the European changeling traditions, which claimed that fairy folk would steal human children and replace them with their own; the Native American skinwalker legends, which spoke of beings that could assume human form; the Japanese tales of tsukumogami, objects that gained sentience after existing for 100 years. Every culture seemed to have stories about things that looked human, but were not. In August 1894, Dr. Marsden received permission from the Smithsonian to conduct a more detailed analysis of the photograph itself. Using the most advanced optical equipment available, she examined every millimeter of the image. She discovered something that had been invisible to casual inspection. In the window of the cabin, barely visible in the shadows, was another face. An adult male, presumably Thomas Kincaid. But his expression was not one of a father watching his family being photographed. It was the expression of a prisoner watching his captors, filled with hopeless terror. She also found, in the extreme lower right corner of the image, a partial word carved into the wooden step where the woman stood. Only 3 letters were visible: "Run." The photographer, whoever they had been, had documented more than just a family portrait. They had documented a warning. Dr. Marsden decided to find the photographer. She knew the image had been created using a wet plate collodion process, which in the 1870s required specialized training and expensive equipment. There could not have been many people practicing this technique in the Appalachian region. She wrote to photography studios in every town within 100 miles of Raven's Gap, requesting information about any photographers who had worked the mountain areas during that period. Most never responded. A few sent polite notes saying they had no relevant information, but one letter, from a photography supply company in Pittsburgh, provided a name: Nathaniel Cook. Nathaniel Cook had operated a small studio in Wheeling from 1869 to 1878, specializing in landscape and documentary photography. According to the supply company's records, Cook had made several trips into the mountains to photograph rural life and had been one of their most skilled clients. But in 1878, he had abruptly closed his studio, sold all his equipment, and disappeared. No forwarding address, no explanation. The company had assumed he had simply moved to another city or given up photography. Dr. Marsden now suspected a different reason for his disappearance. She spent months trying to trace Nathaniel Cook's movements after 1878. Finally, in December 1894, she found him. He was living under an assumed name in a boarding house in Philadelphia, working as a night watchman at a textile mill. When she arrived at his door and introduced herself, his face went white. "You found the photograph," he said. It was not a question. Nathaniel Cook was 47 years old but looked 70. His hair had gone completely white and his hands trembled constantly. He agreed to speak with Dr. Marsden but insisted they meet in a public place during daylight hours. They sat in a park across from Independence Hall, and there, with the sounds of the city around them, Cook told his story. He had traveled to Raven's Gap in September 1877, commissioned by a wealthy Philadelphia family to photograph their ancestral homeland before they sold the property to a lumber company. The journey had taken him into some of the most remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains. On his 3rd day in the region, he encountered Thomas Kincaid, who offered to guide him to several scenic locations in exchange for a small fee. Kincaid seemed like many of the mountain men Cook had met: reserved, practical, competent in the wilderness. They spent 2 days traveling together, and Cook made several successful exposures of waterfalls and forest vistas. On the evening of the 2nd day, Kincaid invited Cook to his cabin for supper. Cook accepted, grateful for the hospitality. When they arrived at the cabin in Raven's Gap, Cook met Martha Kincaid and the child. "I knew immediately something was wrong," Cook said. "The woman looked terrified, not of me, but of the child. And the child looked at me like it had been expecting me, like it had arranged for me to be there." During the meal, which was eaten in almost complete silence, Cook became increasingly uncomfortable. The child did not eat, but simply sat and watched him with those enormous, dark eyes. When Cook asked the child's name, neither parent answered. Finally, Thomas Kincaid said quietly, "We don't speak its name. Speaking the name gives it more power." Cook, disturbed but still operating within his framework of rational explanation, assumed he had encountered a family dealing with a mentally disturbed child. He finished his meal quickly and prepared to leave. But as he stood, the child spoke for the first time. The voice was wrong, Cook said. Too deep, too resonant for a child's throat. It said, "You will make my picture. You will carry it into the world. You will show people what waits in the places they have forgotten." Cook fled the cabin. He rode through the night, desperate to put distance between himself and Raven's Gap. But when he made camp the next morning and checked his equipment, he found that one of his prepared glass plates was missing. He knew with absolute certainty where it was, in the Kincaid cabin. And he knew he had to retrieve it. Not because of the monetary value of the plate, but because leaving it there felt dangerous in a way he could not articulate. He returned to the cabin 2 days later, during full daylight, armed with a pistol he had borrowed from a farmer. The cabin appeared empty. He called out but received no answer. He entered cautiously and found his glass plate sitting on the table, already coated with collodion and clearly exposed. Someone or something had used his equipment to create an image. Beside the plate was a note in handwriting he did not recognize. "Document what you can. Destroy what you cannot." Cook developed the plate using his portable darkroom, working quickly, wanting only to complete the process and leave. When the image appeared in the developing tray, he saw what you have seen. The mother, the child, and those eyes that seemed to look through the photograph into the soul of whoever viewed it. He also saw what he had not noticed when making the exposure: the lack of shadow beneath the child, the face in the window, the partial word "run" carved into the step. He packed his equipment and fled the mountains, but he could not flee the photograph. Every time he looked at it, he felt the child looking back. He began experiencing vivid nightmares in which he stood in a dark forest while something approached through the trees. He would wake screaming, certain that something stood at the foot of his bed, watching him with eyes that reflected the moonlight. In desperation, he closed his studio and tried to abandon photography entirely. But the photograph remained. He could not destroy it. Every time he tried, his hands refused to cooperate, as though some force prevented him from eliminating this documentation. Finally, in March 1892, he decided to send it to the Smithsonian. If he could not destroy the image, perhaps he could at least ensure it was locked away where few people would see it, preserved but contained. He included the note that had been left with the glass plate, hoping someone would understand the warning. Then he changed his name, moved to Philadelphia, and tried to forget. "But you can't forget," Cook told Dr. Marsden. "It's always there, in the back of your mind. Those eyes, watching, waiting." He looked at her with profound sadness. "And now you found it. Now it's watching you too." Dr. Marsden asked the question that had driven her investigation from the beginning. "What is it? What was that child?" Cook shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I know it wasn't born. It was invited. Those symbols carved into the cabin walls? Thomas Kincaid cut those. I saw tools in the cabin, saw wood shavings on the floor beneath the carvings. He was trying to contain something, trying to control it, but you can't control something like that. You can only hope to survive it." He paused, then added, "The worst part is not knowing how many there are. Is it one thing that moves from place to place, person to person? Or are there many, scattered across the world, watching from borrowed faces, waiting for their moment?" Dr. Marsden spent the train ride back to Baltimore in a state of profound unease. She had sought rational explanations and found only deeper mysteries. Every answer generated new questions. If the child in the photograph was not human, what was it? If Thomas Kincaid had invited or summoned it somehow, why? And most disturbingly, was it still there, in that abandoned cabin in Raven's Gap, waiting for another photographer, another visitor, another opportunity to be documented and spread into the wider world? Upon her return, Dr. Marsden wrote a comprehensive report detailing her investigation. She included the testimony from Reverend Hartwell, the information from Sarah Good, the interview with Nathaniel Cook, and her own observations from visiting the cabin. She concluded that the photograph documented something that existed outside conventional anthropological categories, something that demanded further investigation despite the personal risks involved. She submitted the report to her dissertation committee at Johns Hopkins University in January 1895. The response was swift and unequivocal. Her committee rejected the report entirely. They informed her that her methodology had become compromised by sensationalism and superstition, that she had abandoned scientific rigor in favor of folklore and hysteria. If she wished to complete her degree, she would need to select a new research topic and approach it with appropriate academic discipline. The photograph, they suggested, should be returned to the Smithsonian and forgotten. It had no place in serious scholarship. Dr. Marsden refused. She withdrew from Johns Hopkins and dedicated herself to independent research. She sold family property to fund her work and spent the next 3 years investigating similar cases across the United States. She collected accounts of children with unusual appearances or behaviors, families that isolated themselves in remote areas, photographs that seemed to disturb everyone who viewed them. She documented 17 cases that shared characteristics with the Kincaid family, though none as thoroughly documented as the photograph from Raven's Gap. In 1898, she returned to Raven's Gap one final time. She traveled alone against the advice of everyone who knew about her research. Local people in Richwood tried to dissuade her, warning that the hollow had acquired an even worse reputation in the years since her first visit. Hunters who ventured near Raven's Gap reported hearing children's voices in the forest when no children were present. Several men claimed to have seen a small figure watching them from the tree line, always at dusk, always still. One hunter had fired his rifle at the figure, and the bullet had struck the tree behind it without apparent effect. The figure had simply smiled and stepped backward into the shadows. Dr. Marsden entered Raven's Gap on October 31, 1898. She carried with her a copy of the photograph, extensive notes on the symbols she had documented on her previous visit, and a determination to finally understand what she had been investigating for 4 years. She told the owner of the boarding house where she was staying that if she did not return within 3 days, he should contact the authorities. She did not return. A search party found her 5 days later, sitting in the main room of the Kincaid cabin, alive but unresponsive. Her eyes were open, but she did not react to voices or touch. The photograph lay on the floor before her, and her notebook was filled with page after page of the same symbols that covered the cabin walls, written in her normally precise handwriting but repeated obsessively, spiraling into smaller and smaller circles until the text became illegible. She was brought back to Richwood and examined by a physician, who could find no physical cause for her condition. Her body was healthy, but her mind had retreated to some unreachable place. Dr. Helena Marsden spent the remaining 32 years of her life in a private sanitarium in Baltimore. She never spoke again, but nurses who cared for her reported that sometimes, late at night, she would sit up in bed and stare at the wall with an expression of absolute terror, and her eyes, they said, seemed to track something invisible as it moved across the room, something that watched her with patient, ancient attention. The photograph remained in the Smithsonian's collection. Over the following decades, several researchers requested access to it, drawn by references in Dr. Marsden's published papers or by mentions in folklore collections. Most examined it briefly and returned it to the files without comment. But a very few, began to report the same experiences that had plagued the original archivists in 1892. Dreams of forests and watching eyes, a sensation of being observed when alone, an inexplicable certainty that the photograph was not a captured moment, but an open portal through which something continued to look. In 1924, the Smithsonian reorganized its photographic archives, and the image was temporarily misplaced. When an inventory was conducted in 1930, the photograph could not be located. Some files indicated it had been transferred to another institution, but those records were incomplete and contradictory. Other documents suggested it had been destroyed in a fire, though no such fire was recorded in institutional history. The most likely explanation, admitted quietly among archivists, was that someone had deliberately removed and hidden or destroyed the photograph, deciding that some documents should not be preserved. But that explanation assumes the photograph required the Smithsonian to continue existing. Nathaniel Cook discovered that he could not destroy his copy. Others who have encountered the image report similar experiences. The photograph resists elimination, as though the thing it depicts has some investment in being seen, in being spread, in finding new viewers who will look into those eyes and feel themselves watched in return. In 1973, a photography collector in New York purchased an estate lot that included what appeared to be an original 1870s album in print. The image showed a woman and child before a cabin in the mountains. The child's eyes seemed unusual, and the composition was striking enough that the collector had it professionally examined. Authentication confirmed it was indeed an original print from that period, and the collector placed it in his private collection. 2 months later, he donated the photograph to a small historical society in West Virginia, claiming he could no longer keep it in his home. He told the society's director that he had begun seeing the child's face in reflections, in windows, in the surface of still water. He had to be rid of it. The Historical Society accepted the donation and filed the photograph in their archives. It remains there today in a box marked Appalachian Families Unknown, circa 1877. Few people have requested to see it. Those who do often return it quickly, offering polite thanks but no further comment. And late at night, when the building is empty and locked, security cameras occasionally capture something that should not be there. A small figure, standing motionless in the archive room, face turned upward toward the camera, eyes reflecting the infrared light like polished glass. The Kincaid cabin in Raven's Gap collapsed completely in 1952, the rotted wood finally surrendering to gravity and weather. But local people still avoid that hollow, especially after dark. And sometimes hikers who ignore the warnings report seeing a child standing among the trees, perfectly still, watching them with eyes too large and too knowing for any human child. When these hikers try to approach, the child simply turns and walks deeper into the forest, moving with a fluidity that seems wrong, as though the body is not bound by the same physical laws as everything else. The photograph that arrived at the Smithsonian in 1892 documented more than just a family in Appalachia. It documented a phenomenon that predates photography, that exists in the spaces where human habitation meets wilderness, where isolation breeds desperation, and where desperate people sometimes invite things they cannot control into their lives and their families. The photograph is evidence. Not of the supernatural, perhaps, but of something equally disturbing. The persistence of certain presences across time, the way some images burn themselves into human consciousness and refuse to fade, the possibility that by observing something intensely enough, we give it power to observe us in return. What was the child in the photograph? Was it something that entered the Kincaid family through ritual or accident? Was it a genetic anomaly, a medical condition, or something that science has no category for? These questions may be unanswerable. But perhaps the more important question is not what it was, but what it wanted, and whether by preserving its image, by passing it from archive to archive, viewer to viewer, we are giving it exactly what it sought. Endless opportunities to look out at us from the past, patient and unblinking, waiting for that moment when we look back and feel the terrible certainty that we are not alone in the act of seeing. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. If this story moved something in you, if it made you question what watches from the forgotten places, give this video a like. And share it with someone who appreciates that history is not always what we're told, that some photographs are not memories but warnings, and that the past is never as dead as we pretend. Because some images refuse to be forgotten, and some eyes never stop watching.